Voice of sharing Durian ASEAN.
Hi, this is Arlene and you are listening to Durian ASEAN, the voice of discovery and sharing. Just now we have a bit of technical glitch, but now we are connected to Renuka. Hi, Renuka.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Today we'll be speaking on the topic related to refugees in conjunction with the International Refugees Day on the 20th of June, entitled Living Dangerously, the Plight of Refugees in ASEAN. So share with us about your background, especially dealing with refugees.
Right. I'm a member of the Malaysian Bar's Human Rights Committee, and prior to that, as a member of the Legal Aid Committee, we used to provide legal representation to refugees and other asylum seekers who ran into trouble with the law. So most often the kinds of problems that refugees in Malaysia face are, for example, arbitrary detention. They get arrested and they remain in detention camps. Those who get sentenced for illegal entry are subject to corporal punishment, which is whipping. We also have refugees being returned to their country of origin. And then, of course, those who seek work, if they should be unfairly dismissed, there's no redress for them. Women and children, they are a separate category. Children face problems such as inability to access education, and women are often victims of sexual and gender-based violence. These are very broadly some of the common human rights abuses that refugees in Malaysia face.
Mm-hmm. How many are they? What is the number of refugees in Malaysia right now?
Okay, so in the most recent study released by UNHCR, as at September 2013, the number of refugees and asylum seekers registered with UNHCR is 115,819. We're looking at just a little over 100,000. These are just those who managed to get registered with UNHCR. I think the public is not aware that very often refugees fleeing persecution, they are in a state of desperation. They are really just looking to flee. And then when they flee, it takes them a lot of time to get accustomed to the new country they come to, find out the location of the UNHCR office, and even make it to go and get registered. And even when they arrive at the gates of UNHCR, they don't get registered right away. It can take as many as 2 years to get registered. And with regard to the Burmese population, which is the largest number, there are out of the 115,000 that I mentioned earlier, 107,000 are from Myanmar.
I see. Which part of Myanmar, which ethnic groups are they from?
They are comprising Chin, 38,000, Rohingyas, 31,000, Myanmar Muslims, 10,000, nearly 8,000 Rakhine, and 3,600 Burmese and Burmas.
And how do you define refugees? Are they political refugees, or do you expand the definition to include refugees coming from a certain, lower social, economic background? Sorry.
No, the term refugee is a legal definition that's described in the Refugee Convention, and it is very specific that they have to be escaping persecution. So the persecution that they're escaping might be political persecution, religious persecution, persecution by reason of being a member of a particular class. In some cases, being a woman is a class that is subject to persecution. These are some of the examples of persecution that one might face. So long as the refugee or the asylum seeker is able to fit within this broadish definition of having fled by reason of persecution, then he would qualify for registration.
For Malaysia, do we recognize this refugee, or is it only as they are only being taken care by UNHCR and other NGO groups?
You see, internationally, by international law, once a refugee has been classified as a refugee, or whether by the state or by UNHCR, that gives that refugee a sort of legal status. And now, because Malaysia has not signed on to the Refugee Convention, it's not within that framework, not within that legal framework. Malaysia's engagement in this entire refugee process is within the framework of, say, diplomatic or humanitarian framework. So, for example, there's a discretion involved there. If we want to give protection, we can. If we don't want to give protection, we don't have to. We're not legally bound. So it's kind of like playing outside the lines of the game. That's where Malaysia is playing. And UNHCR obviously is the UN body, and they are trying their best to play within the lines of the game, but there's only so much they can do within this type of framework where the country of asylum is not has not signed on to playing the game officially, as it were.
And how long have we been receiving refugees in Malaysia? As in, like, we see them as
from the 70s with the Vietnamese boat people, but even then it was under the same framework, the humanitarian as well as diplomatic arrangements.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So during the 70s, it was the Vietnamese. Later on, what sort of what waves of refugees that came to Malaysia?
We had the Achinese, and then we also had people from Bosnia. I think I omitted to mention just now, when I talked about the 107,000 from Myanmar, the largest population of refugees in the country, there are some, in addition to them, there are some 8,000 or 9,000 from other countries like Sudan, Palestine, Iran, and many other non-Asian countries. So Afghanistan, Sri Lanka. So you will find that there are certain countries which tend to be known as refugee-producing countries, and we do have refugees from there as well. I think it's useful to know that Malaysia is actually a lot more significant than many people are aware of, because of the fact that if you look at UNHCR's global statistics, Malaysia is the highest, tops the list of resettlement submissions.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Meaning, worldwide, Malaysia has the largest number of people being resettled out. And in 2012, that figure was 15,000 only. Right? So out of the 115,000 refugees recorded in 2013, for example, in 2012, according to 2012 statistics, 15,000 people were resettled out of Malaysia. Right? So you can see how small the fraction is. And yet, this figure is the largest in the world.
I see.
In terms of resettlement.
But why Malaysia is the country that is the choice for resettlement?
Because I believe that's because the human rights situation in Malaysia is so protracted, and there is no protection for refugees. The UNHCR is trying to do its best to resettle out those who are stuck in this protracted situation. And out of that figure of 15,000 that I mentioned just now, refugees from Myanmar are the largest number to be resettled.
Oh, to where usually they would be resettled?
Most of the resettlements go to the U.S., but there are other countries also who take refugees for resettlement, such as Australia, Norway, and such countries. But I think the important, from an ASEAN perspective, what is really important which cannot be avoided is the fact that the ASEAN non-intervention policy is very detrimental to Malaysia because of the fact that we have Myanmar, member of ASEAN, which is the largest refugee-producing country insofar as Malaysia is concerned, Myanmar is also sending migrant workers to Malaysia.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, Myanmar is bleeding manpower.
Mm-hmm.
And this manpower, mostly unskilled, is spilling out into ASEAN.
I see.
Thailand as well as Malaysia. Thailand is having as big a problem with Myanmarese refugees in its borders. Thailand also has not signed on to the Refugee Convention. And from this perspective, Myanmar ought to take more responsibility for its citizens. Now, we know that the cause of the problem is Myanmar doesn't even consider most of them its citizens because of the violence against ethnic groups.
The Rohingya you're referring at?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I mean, it's not just the Rohingya. There are many other minority ethnic groups against which there is violence and military presence, causing these ethnic minorities to flee and live in the borders of Myanmar.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, between June and October last year, more than 100,000 people were displaced. And this is just the Rohingya and Kaman. So, and a lot of them are Muslim minorities and other ethnic minorities. So, for example, there are a large number of Christian minority groups. So, I think it's very dysfunctional for ASEAN states to continue with this non-interventionist, we're not going to tell our neighbors what to do attitude when it is in fact severely impacting the neighboring states. It is facilitating human smuggling and human trafficking, and there's just no saying we can't even begin to have the discussion about the social problems that are arising as a result of significant numbers of asylum seekers and refugees with no access to medical attention, no access to education, living in these neighboring ASEAN countries.
I see. So we will take a short break. We will return back on more discussion about the situation in ASEAN countries in relation with the refugees.
Sure.
The voice of sharing Durian ASEAN.
Hi, welcome back to Durian ASEAN. This is Arlene. You're listening to Durian ASEAN, the voice of discovery and sharing. And we will continue our conversation today on the topic Living Dangerously, the plight of refugees in ASEAN. So first off, regarding on how the ASEAN countries react to the situation of refugees, Renuka, as a human rights lawyer, why do you think ASEAN countries, member countries and ASEAN governments are doing enough in terms of protecting the rights of refugees in Southeast Asia?
Well, certainly not, because they have basically abdicated the responsibility to UNHCR, which in fact is working on a very, very limited budget in both countries, namely Thailand and Malaysia. The number of ratifications of the Refugee Convention in Southeast Asia is very small. I think only Indonesia and the Philippines have signed on to the Refugee Convention. Apart from that, none of the countries have. So this is like we are all hosting refugees, but only 2 countries have actually signed on to playing by the rules. Then, in addition to that, all the countries, naturally Malaysia and Singapore tend to be receiving countries within this region where of migrant workers, whereas the other countries are all sending countries and are significantly more underdeveloped than Malaysia and Singapore. I believe Thailand is on par with or slightly higher than Malaysia at this point. I'm not clear of the statistics. So because of this dynamic, I think that there is a lot to be said about the role that economic migration is also playing within this region. And I think the voice of corporations, businesses, is very silent in this entire discussion concerning forced migration. Whether or not the refugees are, or rather the influx of people from the region is coming because of economic migration, meaning looking for work, or because of persecution, I think we cannot deny the fact that within at least countries like Thailand, Malaysia and Singapore, there is a significant need for labor. There is a labor shortage, which is presently being filled by the citizens of its neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this discussion is also rather, is not being developed thoroughly enough. At the ASEAN level, the discussions tend to be more about national security and the sovereignty of the states. The states shouldn't be telling each other what to do.
And economic development of ASEAN countries as well, but not so much on the human rights perspective, especially on the rights of refugees. And why do you think they do not want to touch on this topic on the ASEAN level?
Well, generally the reason given is that they don't have the resources to be able to consider the human rights angle. There seems to be a perception that considering human rights, the human rights of the citizens of ASEAN will involve significant expenses. There seems to be this idea that they have to emulate systems like in Australia or in the UK or in the US, where there is a system of, providing money to the refugees or providing additional healthcare or education. But I think that is not the be-all and end-all of the situation, because they're ignoring the fact that enabling many of these migrants to formally get into the labor force will inevitably bring revenue to the state, whether through taxes, or the levies that they pay, or through just the economic development of the businesses they are contributing to. So I think that whole angle is being ignored, and the negative side of it is always being focused on, the fact that it's going to be costly to these states, or that it's going to cause tensions within the citizens of the states, or that the disparity in the services or the rights accorded to the non-citizens is going to cause some kind of violence.
Mm-hmm.
So there are all these perceptions which are not actually premised on any kind of study or fact.
Mm-hmm. Is there any countries within Southeast Asia that actually signed the UN Convention to recognize the refugee status?
I believe it's Indonesia and the Philippines, but I need to check that.
Mm-hmm. And for this, the countries that has signed the refugee status, have they done anything in terms of trying to protect the rights of refugees?
Well, I really can't comment on what exactly is being done. I believe, I can't comment on the situation in Thailand and the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
But from what I know, based on the interviews with refugees here in Malaysia, there doesn't appear to be any impetus to, for example, seek asylum in Indonesia or the Philippines. And I believe that perhaps the biggest pull factor about Malaysia being the country for seeking asylum is that the tiny doorway for resettlement is slightly larger here than in other countries based on past experience.
Mm-hmm. Let's focus on Malaysia, since you mentioned about Malaysia. You said you mentioned earlier that refugees have been coming to Malaysia since the 1970s, and they have been carrying the identification card of refugees. I guess the UNHCR card when it comes to their own identity. So what about their children's and the generation after them? Are they being recognized as Malaysians, or are they still being recognized as the children of refugees, and they should be having the refugee status as well?
As far as the Vietnamese refugees, I believe the last refugee was either resettled or returned to Vietnam sometime in the early 80s, sometime in the late 80s. So that group came and they sought protection for temporarily, and then they left. whether because of resettlement or because of return to voluntary repatriation after peace into Vietnam. Similarly, with the Acehnese, also many came only temporarily, and then when the violence had ended, they returned to their countries of origin. So this is what happened with previous refugees.
What about the ones that settled during the 90s or the early 2000s? I guess majority of the Myanmar refugees, have they, what is their plight of their children and the generation after them?
So I know of, for example, Rohingya refugees who also come within the category of the stateless, who have been here in Malaysia for over 20 years, who have had kids who are all grown up now. And they didn't have a chance to go to school. They don't have the opportunity to get work. Now, can you imagine families, okay? Just now I told you the numbers are something like over 10,000. Families living without the ability to get legal work or formal work, without children being able to go to school. Can you just have imagine, and obviously not being very financially well off, can you imagine the kind of problems that they tend to face at home? They can't even get married or get divorced formally. All right. So, if, for example, a refugee woman faces domestic violence at home because say her husband is constantly getting involved in gangs or being arrested by the police, what kind of redress is she likely to have? What kind of support is she likely to have? The children also can't get jobs. They have to try to eke out a living with whatever comes their way. And so this is kind of some of the social problems that will come up as a result of protracted refugee situation. Without any protection.
Why they are not being recognized as Malaysian when the kids are being born in Malaysia?
This is the situation. This is why we have a whole lot of stateless people in the country, because of the fact that they have been registered with UNHCR, maybe the parents or even the children are registered with UNHCR, the Malaysian government considers that, okay, we'll just wait for them to get resettled. But unfortunately, with regard to Rohingya, the numbers of resettlement aren't as large as some of the other ethnic groups. I think the perception generally is the Rohingya are Muslim, they're in a Muslim country, they are likely to get better protection from Malaysians. So why transport them to a Western civilization? So that's how the Rohingya, for example, are caught in this catch-22 position.
The international community, have they done anything to voice up their concern over refugees in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I mean, every year Malaysia will be on the top 10 list of worst countries.
Really?
Yeah. So there is a lot of condemnation of Malaysia's treatment of the refugees. Generally, the situation of protection of refugees in Southeast Asia is one that is considered to be very depressing. Earlier, as I was talking to you about in relation to your question about the number of Southeast Asian countries who have ratified the convention, I just checked the records. It's only Cambodia and the Philippines.
Oh, okay.
Southeast Asia.
So for these two countries, why they choose not to settle themselves to Philippines and Cambodia? And in fact, Cambodia they have some of their refugees, I think in the past, in Malaysia as well, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, I believe it's the Hmong from Cambodia or is it from Laos? There are some...
in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken, or 80s.
That was, I think, during the war, right? We probably did have, it was Kampuchea back then. Yeah. So, sorry, what was your question again?
My question about Philippines and Cambodia. Why these refugees do not choose to settle to this country, instead move to Malaysia to to seek for help?
I think, as with the situation in Malaysia, And with many countries that have signed, for example, in Africa, that have signed on to the Refugee Convention, the countries themselves are so poor, they don't actually have very much to offer refugees. So, for example, the masses in the Philippines are struggling with finding work opportunities themselves. The same for in Cambodia. Whereas in Malaysia, I think many refugees find that they somehow or other can find some work to do.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody is prepared to hire them. So there are means of informally getting work. That's, I think, one pull factor. So even though you know that you will not get a lot of protection, you are at risk of arrest, whipping, even detention, even being returned to your country of origin, you know that maybe in between all of that, you probably will be able to find some work, and that there is a chance that you would get resettled. I think this is probably one of the pull factor for refugees coming to Malaysia.
But Malaysia is not really a perfect country. I mean, if you go to the Kuala Lumpur city area, especially in the areas of Bukit Bintang, you will see some I'm not sure whether they are refugees or they are migrant workers. They seem to be begging for money along the streets, especially if you could see like Rohingya women. And we're just wondering, like, what is the social perception and treatment towards these refugees in Malaysia?
Well, I think now there's more awareness of what exactly a refugee is and how a refugee is different from any other destitute person or even any other migrant. So public awareness, at least in the urban areas, is rising. But in terms of the government's perception, legally speaking, there is no difference. You are either documented or undocumented. If you're documented, you should be working or have the right to remain in the country. If you're undocumented, you should be sentenced and deported. Or if you can't be deported because of non-refoulement obligations, then you just have to stay in detention camps. So we have asylum seekers who didn't get a chance to get registered with the UNHCR, who are staying in detention camps under very squalid conditions, where the death rates annually are very high. We have refugees staying there for as much as 1 year, 2 years.
About the recent case in Malaysia regarding on Malaysian deporting Sri Lankan refugees, and we have been slammed by it as well. But what is your view on this issue of deporting refugees back to their own home countries when they themselves are not safe to be in their home countries?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a significant and very deplorable action on the part of the Malaysian government, and one that it is in fact entitled to do simply because it hasn't signed on to the Refugee Convention. It is a violation of human rights. What the Malaysian government has done. The premise of the Refugee Convention is, if somebody is escaping persecution, it is their right to seek protection to, save their lives. Now, if the Malaysian government literally stabs their back by cooperation with their government and sends them back, there's just no use talking about human rights and international law and things like that. It's really these values such as human rights and international law have to be submitted or to diplomacy because of the diplomatic cooperation between the countries. Basically, Malaysia is giving a message that our diplomatic relations with our neighboring countries are more important than human rights. When in fact human rights are non-negotiable; they are applicable to everyone. This is what we agreed to when we joined the United Nations. It's, I would say it's very dysfunctional.
What are the challenges that the refugee faces? These refugees face in Malaysia when they, when they first arrive. Recently there's an issue. Although they are not refugees, they are just illegal immigrants from Indonesia that their boat was sank in the middle of the ocean in near to the Malaysian shore. What about the plights of refugees? What are the challenges that they would face when they come to countries like Malaysia and resettle themselves in countries like Malaysia as well?
As I was mentioning earlier, I think the biggest problem that they would face is, when you're in a new country, you don't know how the language, you don't even know how to get from one place to another. Even if you know someone, you need to, get a phone or a phone line to contact them. The usual problems that you would face while traveling. And then you might be staying with a friend. How long can you stay with a friend without any money? Because the question of not having any money is a very significant problem. And then trying to be able to find work, constantly being told that don't go out, you get arrested, don't go out, somebody's going to come and try to extort money from you. So always living in that situation of fear that they are going to either get arrested or that they don't have money for the next meal or those kinds of problems. And then, for example, those who end up looking for relationships and end up having children, the fact that their marriages are not legal, even if they should get resettled, they won't be able to take their spouse with them. Basically family disunity, having families split up, and all those social ills that come with a dysfunctional family system.
So how does UNHCR come into the picture? Do they seek actively for these refugees, or the refugees happen to, get a contact of UNHCRs in Malaysia?
Yeah, non-Burmese refugees, meaning from all the other countries in the world, are entitled to just go up to the gate and get an appointment. Usually they'll get an appointment in a few months' time. Mm-hmm. Whereas if they are Burmese, they need to locate their respective community groups. So there are these so-called associations or so-called community groups of, say, Kachins or Rohingyas or Karens, all over Kuala Lumpur. And there are some groups in other parts of the country as well. So they have these little associations where their job is to collect the names of these refugees who want to get registered by UNHCR. And these guys are supposed to submit those names to UNHCR. However, because UNHCR is so short-staffed and claims that it doesn't have the budget or the capacity to be registering 100,000 refugees, that process of registering these refugees is very, very slow. So, for example, I know of one of my clients who has not been able to get registered even though he's been in the country for 6 years.
Oh, wow. 6 years is a long time.
Yeah. And during that 6 years, he was arrested, whipped, deported, and he managed to come back in again by paying another smuggler and coming back in. So the people smuggling racket, as you can see, is thriving because of this situation of the way things are.
Mm-hmm. So what is the way forward? I mean, you coming from a human rights background, how can ASEAN if you have the capacity to advise ASEAN governments or ASEAN ASEAN as a whole, what is the best mechanism for countries to be able to protect the rights of refugees? At the same time, they don't have to feel that it's a huge burden for them. I think countries have perception that, what if I rectify the the UN's Convention on Refugee? That means it will be influx of hundreds and thousands of refugees coming to the country and become new citizens. So how do you address those fears and at the same time protect the rights of refugees?
Yeah, I think there really does appear to be a solution, a win-win solution. Mm-hmm. I think especially the countries that are seeking to develop, in whether you're a sending country or a receiving country, all the ASEAN countries have one thing in common. They're all looking for greater development, economic development. And many of the sending countries rely on remittances from their overseas workers for their own development. So, for example, Philippines is really dependent on its remittances from overseas workers. Bangladesh is also, Nepal is also. So, I think it's a win-win situation because countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand really do have a labor shortage in terms of the foreign investments that are coming into their country. They don't have sufficient workforce to be able to get those jobs done. Now, instead of simplifying the process for businesses to be able to engage workers, train them, and keep them there, the governments of the receiving countries tend to make it more difficult than is necessary. I think this is also where the issue of transparency and integrity comes in, because complaints of corruption among governments in many of these countries, many of these receiving countries, profiteering from these exploitative situations is a gap that needs to be looked at. So, but as far as the trend among businesses in these receiving countries goes, what they tend to be saying is that the labor shortage just isn't being adequately met. Now, if the receiving countries make it such that the non-citizen in these countries are permitted to deal directly with employers looking to hire and become employed.
I guess a more transparent system within the Southeast Asian region.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
so, they will be able to contribute to the economy.
Yeah, that's true.
They will have their own protection.
And the country, I think the region will prosper as well in a way.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much. We are at the end of the show of the segment for ABC Dialogue. Thanks for providing us a very interesting insight on the refugee status in Malaysia as well as in Southeast Asia and the way forward for ASEAN to tackle this problem.
You're very welcome. Have a good day.
Yeah.